Okay, so to start, can you state your full name for me, please?
Yes, my name is Christopher John Thompson, and I was born in Dunedin, New Zealand in 1942.
What were your parents' names?
My parents? My father's name was Francis Richard Thompson, but he was known as Dick. And my mother's name was Hypatia Inga Johnson, and she preferred the name Paish. Nicknames were very popular in New Zealand. Hardly anyone was known by their full name. So, and I was called, when I was young, my mother called me Kit because she didn't like Chris, but eventually I became, to my friends, I became Chris, and the Kit was just a family name used within the family.
Right. And can you tell me a little bit about your parents, like what they did?
Yes, my father, my father was a public accountant in the firm of, it was then called Thompson and Lang in Dunedin, New Zealand, and it was the oldest. It's the oldest surviving public accountancy firm in New Zealand, and his father started the firm and also started the the New Zealand Society of Public Accountants. My father was during the Second World War. My father was initially in the New Zealand Home Guard, and then in 1943 he was called up for overseas service, and he served with the New Zealand Army Expeditionary Force, I think it was called, originally in Egypt and then later on in Italy, and he didn't come home until 1946. So I was about 6 months old when he left, and I was about 2.5, 3.5 when he came back from the war in 1946. My mother was an English teacher. Her father was from Denmark, and his original name was Hans Peder Johansson, and then he became Henry Peter Johnson after he came to Dunedin. He started a fish business, and at one stage they had the biggest fish shop in the city, and they had I think 6 boats catching fish off the coast to bring in fresh fish every day to the city, because there wasn't very much refrigeration at that time. And my parents were married in 1939, and I'm the youngest of, I'm the second of 3 boys. My oldest brother followed the company business and went into public accountancy, as did his son. So there are actually 4 generations of public accountants in that family. My younger brother he's just recently retired. He was a language teacher in Christchurch, New Zealand, and my older brother, he's also retired. They had 5 children, and my younger brother has 3 children. And I think is that enough for the family history, or
yeah.
Then what next?
So can you tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up in New Zealand?
In the early days, of course, I don't remember very much. I didn't know my father when he came back from the war, because I really, I couldn't recognize people when I was only 6 months old when he left, and I had no idea who he was when he came back, and but. During the war, everything was rationed, and even though there was a lot of milk and butter and wheat and everything, because New Zealand was very much an agricultural country then. Almost all of it was being sent to for the war effort. So there was meat was rationed, wool was rationed, eggs were rationed. Everything was sent as part of New Zealand's war effort. So it was very difficult must have been very difficult bringing up children, particularly for my mother. We're only 14 months apart, and she obviously didn't have a car, and Dunedin is a very hilly city. It's really quite hillier than anything I imagine in that I can think of in Canada. It's a bit like San Francisco in terms of hills. There's even cable cars like San Francisco, and I went to school. Started off, we were a Catholic family, and at that time, Catholic children had to go to a Catholic school, and unless there were special circumstances. So I went. I had about 4 years at school with a mixed boys and girls school, and then after about 4 or 5 years, I went to a school called Christian Brothers School, which was run by the Christian Brothers, Irish Christian Brothers, who were also established in Canada, and I was there for 4 years in primary school and then 5 years in secondary school, and in my third year in secondary school, there is a national exam that's sat by everyone who reaches that grade called school certificate, and at the beginning of that year, I came down with rheumatic fever, and was 6 weeks in hospital with a very, very high temperature, and so missed the first weeks of school, quite a few weeks of school. But I think partly because of that, I was encouraged to work a little bit harder, and I think at that stage I became much better at school than I would have been maybe around 10th in a class of 50, if you can imagine 50 kids in a secondary school class. But I ended up 2 years later being the dux of the school, like the top person in the school, which was my parents were very thrilled about that, and I'm not quite sure how I managed it, but it did put me in very good stead when I entered university. And at that time, university education was free as long as you passed. Your next year's fees were paid. If you failed, then you had to pay your fees. But otherwise, as long as you passed, your fees were paid. And because I stayed on an extra year at school, I got a small amount of money as a bursary as well. And I worked during the summer holidays as a student labourer most of the time, earning money to get to. Okay, so I think I'd got up to the point where education was free university education was free in New Zealand, and I started a degree, a science degree in 1961, and I elected to major in physics, and I did a Bachelor of Science degree with honours, which was a 4-year course at the University of Otago, which is it's the oldest university in New Zealand, but it's also in my hometown, which meant that I was able to go. I never had to leave home to study. And during that time, I got very keen on outdoor activities, and we used to go used to go hiking and alpine climbing in the Southern Alps of New Zealand, and I became relatively good at. I was no good at rock climbing, but I really enjoyed the snow climbing and the long hikes that the group did, and made some very good friends there. And but then I decided to stay on to do a master's degree in physics, and between my finishing my bachelor's degree and starting my master's degree, during the summer holidays, I had an opportunity to go to Australia and work at the Australian Atomic Energy Research Establishment, which is just south of Sydney. And I went there with one of my colleagues who was a year younger than me in the physics program, and I spent 3 months working at this place called Lucas Heights, and I was very fortunate there in that I met up with Dr. Alistair Tavendale, who had just finished his a postdoc at the Atomic Energy of Canada Chalk River Nuclear Laboratories up the Ottawa River. And he had just come back. He was an Australian who had just come back to basically start his career there. And I had the opportunity of helping him set up his lab. And he must have given me a very good reference, because halfway through during my master's degree project, there were no, I'd done all the courses, so it was just a research project that I was doing. And halfway through that year, I suddenly realized I have to think about what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And I looked in various magazines thinking, you know, there may be jobs advertised, and found a couple of jobs advertised. And I applied for one in Ottawa at Atomic Energy of Canada Commercial Products, and another one at Rolls-Royce in England. And the people in Ottawa answered first and asked me a few questions, and eventually I mentioned in one of the letters that perhaps this Dr. Tavendale could give me a reference, and I guess he did give me a good reference, because I actually got the job without ever having an interview or anything like that, which, you know, today sounds pretty unusual. And so I finished up my, I submitted my thesis at the beginning of December of 1965, and just after Christmas of that year, I left home and boarded. I hitchhiked most of the way from Dunedin to Auckland, and then boarded the ship. It was a P&O line ship, the Oronce, which was doing a cruise of the South Pacific, stopping at various different ports. And so I boarded it in Auckland, and spent the next 2.5 weeks sailing in the Pacific. And on the ship, one of the things I remember about, well, the first thing, leaving New Zealand was that was when the ship was suddenly, you know, starting to disconnect itself from the port. That's the first time I ever felt homesick. It was an adventure up till then, but I can remember just about everyone else who was boarding had somebody on the wharf, and there were streamers. They were throwing streamers down to the wharf, and I didn't have a streamer because I didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone on the boat. I didn't know anyone in Auckland. It was very much, I'd rung my parents that day to say goodbye, and that was about it. But as it turned out, the ship, most of the passengers on the ship were either fairly well-off American or Canadian couples with one or two families, or young people of about my own age in their early 20s from either Australia or New Zealand, who were sort of had left home for the first time. So needless to say, there was a great opportunity to meet people, and because if you didn't know anyone, there were a lot of other people who didn't know anyone too, and so it was very, very easy to make friends. We always sat at the same table together, and there was a couple from Calgary who were there with their two children, and his profession was moving houses and moving relatively large buildings from one place to the other, and they had just set up some, was like a heritage village somewhere in Calgary, and it had moved homesteads and houses and barns and everything from all over, I think, southern Alberta and perhaps Saskatchewan as well, to the, and I guess it made quite a bit of money on that, and so he was enjoying this cruise, and they actually we became very friendly, and they actually invited me to stay with them in Calgary when I first came to Canada. So our trip on the ship was made up of it was quite adventurous because it was the first time I'd really been away and in that kind of environment, and there were all kinds of activities to do for the during the passage, and the ship stopped twice in the Fiji Islands. Once at Lautoka, which is a small, very much a native village on one side, and then the next day we spent in Suva, the capital of Fiji, and then we had about 5 days before we got to Honolulu, and during that time we crossed the international date line, and we also crossed the equator at almost exactly the same time. And one of the things that gets done to people who have never crossed the equator before on a ship like that was to throw them into the swimming pool, preferably fully dressed. And so we got our soaking, and after that they threw ice cream into the pool. So we got thoroughly messed up. And one of the people I'd made friends with at that time decided it would be rather fun because this was all officiated. The captain and the officers were all there. We weren't travelling first class, so he didn't very often come to that part of the boat. So, but we decided it would be rather fun to push the captain into the swimming pool, which we did, and he didn't appreciate that very much at all. Anyway, that was the only prank that we got up to on the boat. But otherwise we had a great time. And I met, I became quite friendly with somebody, a chap on the boat that I met, and we shared a room for a few days in Vancouver just after we arrived, and then took the train to Banff and had a few days in Banff together, and then went on to Calgary. And my first experience arriving in Vancouver was of course, very strange because we'd been on the boat for a long time and we'd left in summer and it was quite cold in Vancouver. So the first action item was to visit the Hudson Bay Company and buy some warm clothes, because of course I didn't have anything that would be very, very suitable in terms of warm clothing. And in Vancouver it wasn't quite as necessary, but once I got to Ottawa it was decidedly necessary to have some warm clothing. So we made some purchases there, and my first meal in Canada, if I remember correctly, was we went into a Woolworths shop on I suppose it would have been on Granville Street in Vancouver. I don't remember, but I guess it was. And I saw that they had pumpkin pie on the menu, and I just couldn't get into my head the idea that you could make a dessert out of pumpkins, because they were something that were always on the first. They were with potato. They were a vegetable and not something. Anyway, that was the first thing I remember eating in Canada was pumpkin pie, and. So we had a few days. We rented a car, I think, for at least a day, and drove around Vancouver a bit, and then we took the train to Banff. And I can remember going through Revelstoke. I'm pretty sure that was the name of the town, and being overwhelmed with the amount of snow. I mean, I'd seen snow, of course, before, but I'd never seen so much snow. And the train seemed to be driving through a canyon with snow on both sides, and the train actually had something in front of it, like a propeller, sort of pushing the snow out of the way. It was really, really spectacular. And we had lovely weather in Banff, and really enjoyed it there. And then I went to Calgary, and where I stayed with the people I mentioned before, the ones who sat at the same dinner table as I did on the boat. And then and then I flew to Vancouver, where my cousin lived with his wife and 3 children, and stayed with them for a few days, and then took the train to Ottawa. And the company, Atomic Energy of Canada, had arranged for an apartment for me to stay in, and I eventually got there with no supplies at all, very and you know, really no way of getting round to a grocery shop or anything like that to go out and buy something, and one thing that I remember quite distinctly about that point is that I think at the time I arrived in Ottawa, I got to the point where I'd just run out of money. And so I'd spent my life savings on this trip. But on the other hand, I did arrive here completely debt-free, and I'd saved the money that I'd saved up, you know, working having these summer holidays, these summer jobs, had been enough to pay for everything. So one of my uncles was keen on going on a trip outside New Zealand a year or so after that, and at that stage it was very, very difficult to get currency from other countries, and so if you were going on a trip, it was extremely difficult to get money, you know, to pay for hotels and have money for incidental expenses while you were traveling, and but if you were leaving the country permanently, you could change money, and he'd actually given me, I think probably the equivalent of perhaps about $500 or something like that, so that he would have that money once he arrived in Canada. He would have that money to pay for other things on his trip, and so I never actually spent any of that money, but I came perilously close to spending it. So, but it was quite interesting. You know, looking back, it was quite interesting to think of that I was able to completely finance that trip, and so I started working just after I think I arrived on Friday, and maybe started working on Monday or Tuesday or something like that. Really, not having very much idea of what I was supposed to be doing. And but I was welcomed into a group. I was working in a group under a man by the name of Ron Tolmie, and it was a group at the Atomic Energy of Canada commercial products. Then its main commercial application was the manufacturing of cobalt therapy machines, which were used for treating cancer, and but and also for making the isotope technetium-99 M, which is the main isotope used in nuclear medicine procedures. And so that isotope was separated in the building where I used to work, and the reactor where it was produced was in Chalk River, about 3 hours drive out of north of Ottawa. And but the group that I was dispatched to under Ron Tolmie, it was called the Industrial Metrology Group, I think, and its mandate was to seek other uses, other commercial uses for radioisotopes, and one of the things that they did was for tracing industrial plants by putting a little bit like what you might do in nuclear medicine, where you swallow a pill and then follow where it goes in the body. Well, this would be swallowing a pill of a fairly an isotope with fairly intense gamma rays like cobalt-60 or cesium-137, and you'd put that into, say, a concrete plant and find out what was getting stuck, and so that was one of the things that I was involved with, was making the instrumentation to detect where these things were. So we'd put a string of detectors in various places where we thought it might end up, and then find out it was the only thing that was radioactive. So it was relatively easy to find. And I worked there for 4 years altogether. And after I'd been there for about 6 months, I think, my boss decided that our group needed a computer, because the people in Chalk River who were doing similar kind of work, they were using computers for analyzing their data. So he decided, okay, put in his budget for a computer, and he got a computer. And because I was the youngest one, I was the one who was delegated to get this thing to actually do something useful, and it was totally and utterly useless as it first came. It was a huge thing, but eventually, I guess eventually we tamed it and built some interfaces to it to allow it to display the images from these devices and also to collect data from them. And so I did all the programming and most of or probably about half of the electronics design, which I shared with a guy by the name of Quentin Bristow, who was a British from England, who shared the office with me. So as I said, I worked there for about 4 years, and after about 3 years, I'd been working there. We used to go. By that time I'd learned how to ski, and we did we used to go cross-country skiing quite a bit, but I also did quite a bit of downhill skiing. And one day I decided that I wanted to go away. I was a bit fed up with the way things were going at work and decided I was going to go away for the weekend. And I decided to go to Montreal by myself for the weekend. So I got in the car, and by mistake, I took the wrong exit from the Metropolitan Boulevard and ended up getting onto the Carry going south instead of the Laurentian autoroute going north. And then, I'll go to J Peak instead. So I drove down the Eastern Townships autoroute, and then I saw a sign saying Mount Sutton. And I thought, I'd never been to Sutton, but I'd heard that was a good place to go skiing. So I decided to go to Sutton instead. And then I mean, this was literally, sort of going the blind leading the blind. I was just looking at signs and following my way around. And anyway, I got to Sutton probably quite late at night, probably about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and ended up finding a hotel at the bottom of on the main street, just at the turnoff going up to the mountain, and stayed there. And then I went skiing the next day, and twice I went up in the chairlift with a girl who was very inquisitive about who this stranger was, who couldn't speak any French, and but her English wasn't too bad. And anyway, she told me that everyone, all her friends, met at a certain pub after skiing, and it turned out she was actually staying at the same hotel as I was staying at. So anyway, I went to this hotel, went to this after ski pub and had a drink, and then she introduced me to another girl who had been skiing with her that day, and then promptly left to chat with the ski patrol. And anyway, this girl, she's my wife of 43 years now. That's how we met. And she spoke a lot less English than the first girl that I met. And so her name is Nicole, and she's the youngest of 12 children, typical French-Canadian family from the east end of Montreal. And so I met her again a couple of weeks later. It was almost Easter time, and she and we ended up both going to the same place again over the Easter holidays. So that was really the time when we actually met, I guess, and formed a bit of a bond there. And during the summer, during that next summer, I came to Montreal quite often, and she came to Ottawa a few times, and I introduced her to the members of the local canoe club. We used to go canoeing, and the group I sort of established myself as. In the summer we went canoeing, and in the winter we went skiing, and I really enjoyed the outdoor kinds of activities there. And she got along well with the few friends, and her mother was a little bit intimidated by the fact that this guy who didn't really speak any French has suddenly started imposing on the family life, because it's certainly not certainly at that time it wasn't very traditional for French Canadian children to meet people from other countries. That was more, it might have been the boy next door or the girl up the court that they met at school or something like that. But anyway, Nicole's mother was a very staunch Catholic, and she had I'd been warned about this, and had to be careful about what I said. So it turned out that my father's youngest sister was a nun she was a member of the missionary sisters of the Society of Mary like Marist nuns, and she had been promoted to their head office in Rome, and I when after a couple of weeks of seeing Nicole over the weekend, and I sort of came in and was presented to the rest of the family and that kind of thing, and I took with me a picture of obviously me and this nun who was actually my aunt, on the top of St. Peter's in Rome, and so that kind of made me, that made me a little bit more acceptable to the rest of the family than I might have been if I'd been an agnostic, perhaps. Anyway, so we got engaged, I guess, a little bit less than a year after we met in February of 1970, and we got married in July of 1970, and we lived on Coolbrook Street, just near the corner of the DeCarry Expressway and Queen Mary Road for about the first 18 months, and then we bought a house in Cartierville, and we've been living there ever since. And we have 4 children, and at the moment 6 grandchildren. And my my oldest son is the marketing manager for respiratory products in a company called Covidian, and he lives in Kirkland and he works in Montreal. I have one daughter. She is a pediatric nurse in Austin, Texas, and she just got married last July, so she was the last one to get married. And then my middle son, Mark, is a specialist in music technology and recording and sound effects and the psychophysical aspects of music, and he's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Jyväskylä in central Finland, and he married a girl from Finland, and they have a daughter who's just turned 2. And then my youngest son is in the Canadian Forces. He's a sergeant. Apparently, he has served 3 terms in Afghanistan. The first 2 when he was in Edmonton with the Princess Patricia's Light Infantry, and more recently he went on the second last group of Canadian soldiers that were over there training the Afghan army in what armies do when they're not actually fighting each other. And he's a communication specialist with the army, and they have 3 children. He lives in Greenfield Park on the South Shore.
What did you know about Canada? Did you know anything about it?
That's a good question. Very little. Most of what I knew was from a boy that I'd gone to school with, who had he was Hungarian and had come to New Zealand as a refugee in 1956 after the revolution in Hungary, and he was in the same class at school with me for about I guess 4 or 5 years, and his father was a medical doctor, but wasn't able to practice medicine as a general practitioner in New Zealand, I think because of his qualifications. But it turned out that he could in Canada, and so after working in the medical school of the University of Otago for a while, he decided to emigrate to Canada, and they moved to Moncton, New Brunswick, and his son, the one who was in the same class as me at school, Peter, used to send, we'd exchange Christmas gifts, and he would send quite big boxes of things over to us, and because the families were quite friendly with one another, but he and I particularly were friendly, and he had told me a little bit about what he was doing and what his life was, but by the time I thought of coming here, I'd completely lost contact with him. I have made contact with him since. He lives in Toronto now, and but no, I really didn't know very much at all, and I think my idea when I was looking for a job was so in my mind it was always a temporary job. I was going to maybe work a couple of years in Canada, maybe a couple of years in the States, a couple of years in England, and then come back to New Zealand. So you were asking me about what I knew about Canada. One of the thing that I remembered most about my cousins or other friends who had left New Zealand, they had all come back, and most of the girl cousins that I knew, if they weren't married when they were in their early 20s, they were saving money for their overseas experience, and these OEs were you just had to go on one of these if you weren't attached in your early 20s. And so my idea would have been that I certainly didn't come to Canada to stay here. I think that would be my main point. It was in my mind some kind of a transit, but it didn't turn out that way. And I think it's because I managed to find something that I liked doing. I enjoyed my work, and then after I met Nicole, of course, we did toy with the idea of going back to New Zealand at one stage, but we've been back on holidays obviously many times, but I've always, so all my work experience, 4 years with Atomic Energy of Canada, and then 37 years at the Montreal Neurological Institute. So that 41 years is all in Canada.
So can you tell me a little bit more about meeting your now wife's very French family, and how you sort of integrated yourself into that?
Yes. Well, for a start, it was I would come to Montreal to spend the weekend after working the weeks in Ottawa. So I got to know the road between Ottawa and Montreal very well. And when I first started doing this, I used to stay at a sort of bed and breakfast place on Sherbrooke Street, which I believe was called the Shangri-La or something, under a bit weird like that. And then Nicole and I would do something on Saturdays, and then I'd take her to her place, and then do something else on Sundays, and then we'd go. Then I'd drive back to Ottawa on Sunday evenings. But during the summer before we were married, I got to know her family, the rest of her family, very well. And although I was kind of out of it because I couldn't follow the conversations at all because they were all in French, I was certainly made very welcome. And one time I remember particularly one of her cousins got married, and I was invited to the wedding as well, and it was in Quebec City, and her older sister, who was the mother of the bridegroom, she spoke very good English, much better than anyone else in the family, and so did her husband. And that was a sort of a point, was quite, it was, I could have quite long and complicated conversations with them, whereas the others were pretty much limited to talking about my limited knowledge of hockey and the weather, I suppose.
So did you take any French classes when you came?
Yes, I did. When I came to Ottawa, I took a couple of French classes, sort of evening classes, which started with the room being overcrowded in the early perhaps in the early winter or something, and then after the first couple of snowstorms ended down to be a trickle and then they merged two classes together, and they weren't particularly successful, but a lot of my friends, my work friends in Ottawa, had married French Canadians. Actually, they were either from England or they were English-speaking Canadians who had married French Canadians, and I kind of saw this as that seemed to work out quite well. And so when I met Nicole, it seemed like I wasn't completely lost in that respect. because of these good friends, but it was a big it's a big family, and they have they have their family things, their family traditions, and that kind of thing, and it was fun to adapt to that, because none of my family ever came. My parents were never able to come and visit me. My younger brother did come and visit me once, and my older brother's been here twice now. So, but very much, I didn't have any. None of my family or friends had ever come here to stay for, just been like for a couple of weeks at a time or something like that.
So what were some of your favorite family traditions of Nicole's family?
Well, the one thing that I'd never experienced before was the Le Jour de l'An, the festivities that take place on New Year's Day. I was used to partying on New Year's Eve, but in my wife's family, New Year's Day was at least as important, if not more so, than Christmas. And so there'd be for the first few years, she would have all the family over at her place, but then it became impossible. So she arranged to rent a room in the basement of the church, and then it became the entire basement of the church. And that's been a family tradition right until last year. So for over 40 years, there's been this family grouping together, and as many as 120 people would be at these gatherings these days. There were a few less this year, but like it's a must-do thing to, and that's really a unifying thing for the family, and it's a wonderful it's a wonderful tradition, I think. And the other thing, the night before Christmas, le réveillon de Noël, that was a great time for parties, and so I remember that. But another thing that I like very much is the cabane à sucre, going to the sugar bush. And we actually went to one yesterday, so I'm still a bit full. But you know, that's the day to pig out during the spring, and then you know, you eat more than you can possibly hold, and then you end up eating maple taffy on the stick, which is not very good. And then you have to drive home on a bumpy road. Not very good for your stomach. But no, those are some. I think the Le Jour de l'An and the cabane à sucre. Those are very. My mother-in-law was also very keen on St. Valentine's Day, but I could never get into St. Valentine's Day. Never appealed to me very much, but she always used to put these little cupids cut out of crepe paper and hang them all over the place, and Nicole inherited all the decorations, so she puts these little cupidons, I think they're called in French, that hang out all over the room, and we're supposed to enjoy their presence for at least a day. And I think those are the things that I remember. But I think also I was very fortunate. I mean, for me, it wasn't just marrying Nicole. It was like the whole family. You know, I was alone. I didn't have any. Well, I wasn't. I mean, I had lots of friends, but I didn't have any family here, and they made me very, very welcome, and they've been very good friends, and we keep in touch now. We're down to, as I said, she was the youngest of 12. She's now the youngest of 5. We've had a lot of deaths of her older siblings, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, and but there's now five families still kind of intact, and we've just arranged to go on a boat cruise together in July. We're going to leave Montreal and cruise to Boston, with stops in Halifax and Charlottetown and Sydney and Bar Harbor, I think, on the way down. So it's like a week long cruise down the St. Lawrence, and then around the Gaspé coast and into Nova Scotia and into the States, and we end up in Boston. So
the réveillon, is that something you still do in your family?
There's yes, in our family, yes, the kids come over. They either come over to our place, or we go to my oldest son Philip and Jenny's place. That's been more common recently, and if we go there, then she invites a lot of her family, and you know, there'll be cousins and her parents will be there, and she's my daughter-in-law is the oldest, and her parents married younger, so you know that there's a lot more. Of course, we're still around, but it just seems like, you know, she has a lot more family than we do. So
what kind of food do you serve for the réveillon?
Well, definitely a tortilla, that's for sure, and let's see. That's what I think of most. Yeah, can't really think of anything else except tortilla right now. But I mean, usually a turkey is cooked for the main meal on Christmas Day and at Easter, and sometimes the turkey is when we go to Philip and Jenny's place. There's usually a turkey or a rather big bird of some other origin is cooked and served, but there's always a lot to eat and a lot to drink, and it goes on for a long time, and somehow the children manage to stay awake, or they get all bundled off to bed and then get carried, then get put into their snowsuits in the wee hours of the morning to be taken home.
So growing up, when your children were growing up, what was the language that you spoke to them at home?
I usually spoke to them in English, and my wife usually spoke to them in French. So the table, it was always a mixed table. Whoever starts the conversation. If we have guests, it ends up, being almost 100% in the language of the guest. Well, if they're English or French. If they're German, then it's usually in English, but or Finnish. It's usually in English, because our other languages are very limited. But our children all went to an English school because I moved to Quebec at the time when if you could prove that you had been to an English school, if one immigrant parent could prove that they'd been to an English school, they could send their children to French to an English school, and we opted to do that because we had heard that the teaching of French in English schools was far better than the teaching of English in French schools. And I think this is still true today. And we're very lucky. Our two grandchildren who are at school now go to a completely bilingual school, and they have English in the morning and French in the afternoon, and then after at the beginning of the year, and then after Christmas they swap round. And they have completely different teachers, completely different, and the school is completely bilingual, and they are very, very fluent in both. The two older ones are very fluent in both languages. So it was. I think it's interesting just the way it worked out, but that's more or less how it's been. We kind of live on the fence when we go out. Something to do with Nicole's family, we tend to socialize more in French than in English. But when we go out with the Kiwis in Montreal group, or the group, from where I used to work at McGill, then the language it sort of become. But we also, I think, more and more so since I've been living here. There are far more English-speaking people who speak very good French now. It was perhaps a bit of a rarity over 40 years ago, but it's become much more common now for English-speaking, sort of native English-speaking Montrealers to speak very good French.
Can you tell me a little bit about Kiwis in Montreal?
Kiwis in Montreal. Okay, that actually started with a friend of mine. His name is Charles Wallace, but everyone calls him Chico, and he's actually from England, but his wife is from Christchurch, New Zealand, and he would have been a great guy as a diplomat. He's great at diplomatic chat and meeting people, introducing people, finding finding ways to the things that people have in common or something like that. And he and another, and they must have known a few people who were from New Zealand, but not very many. And they contacted the New Zealand High Commission in Ottawa to find out, you know, if there were any other, if they had addresses of anyone. Anyway, they contacted people, and we had a first meeting, probably about, I'd say it's going back at least 35 years now, at a restaurant downtown. Like, we rented a room in a restaurant downtown, and some of those people that I met on the first night are still around, and he's since moved to Ottawa. And when he retired, he used to work for CN, and when he retired, he moved to Kanata, and they've started another group there, which goes by the name of Kiwis in and around the Ottawa regional area, which sounds a horrible name, but it turns out if you take those letters, it becomes Kia ora, which means welcome in Maori. So, or hello, you know. It's so he was very good at contriving things like this. But Chico started it, and then there's a core group of about 20 families, perhaps. One of the things that we've found is there hasn't been much recruitment of sort of permanent people to the group. It's been there's sort of a core group of 20 or so families, and people who are passing through, people who have just arrived and then don't stay for very long. And one of the things is that there hasn't been much involvement of the children. You know, there tends to be more of the older people, and of course the group's getting older and older. As you can imagine, a lot of the group that all of the original group have all retired now, but we still meet. We still meet at least 4 times a year, and they're usually sort of potluck suppers. That usually people will bring along, you know, traditional New Zealand recipes, and so there'll always be a leg of lamb. There'll always be a pavlova cake, like a meringue with cream and kiwi fruit or strawberries on top. So I mean, the group. It's basically like maybe 20 odd as a core families, and we don't really have a lot of expenses. We don't have a room, you know, or any you know, any community centre or anything like that. It's all done in people's homes, or we go out to a restaurant or something like that. It's a very small group. There are much bigger groups in Vancouver, and there's another one which is fairly large in Toronto as well. But Vancouver and Victoria have a lot more New Zealanders living there. So inevitably, because it's a little bit nearer, and now of course there are now direct flights between Auckland and Vancouver. Air New Zealand has I think it's 3 times a week service there. So I mean that brings people a lot closer together when you can have it. So it's a long flight, but but now you don't have to stop in Hawaii or somewhere else on the way, and that makes it a lot easier. Well, for visas, for immigration, and you know, you don't have to stop in the middle of the night and get off the plane, go through American immigration, and then get back on the plane again for nothing.
So, did you get your Canadian citizenship?
Yes. I've had my well, I was a landed immigrant right from day one. I had my landed immigrant papers in order to work here that I got from the Canadian High Commission in Wellington before I left, and I don't remember the year when I became a Canadian citizen, but it was. I waited for quite a long time afterwards, not for any particular reason. It just that it wasn't. It really wasn't necessary to. I mean, I could, as coming from New Zealand, I was able to vote in elections, for instance. So now of course you can't, but then you could, and so I think if the situation was for me like it is currently, then probably I would have applied for Canadian citizenship as soon as I could. But our children are also New Zealand citizens. They're citizens by descent, and so we have papers there. We decided to do that because you never know. I mean, I didn't know that I was going to travel and so it just seemed like a good thing to do. And at one stage, Amanda became quite interested in working in Australia, and New Zealand citizens can work in Australia there's a bilateral agreement for working and like free trade as well. So it's quite she could conceivably have worked in Australia without having to go through any immigration procedures.
So have you been back to New Zealand?
Yes, never for an extended period of time. The longest we were there would have been about 6 weeks, and then it was entirely touristy things. Sometimes I've gone over and I've been invited to give a lecture at the university, but that's really the only sort of work kind of related thing. There's I never at one stage I was involved a little bit with a company that were building something that I knew something about, and then trying to establish an overseas market for it, and I helped them a little bit, but not but no, all of the going back has been with holidays. And what we did when the children were growing up was, instead of having a summer vacation every year, we'd have a summer vacation in Canada, and then 18 months later have a summer vacation in New Zealand. So we'd to spend Christmas and New Year, and then go particularly with my older brother's family. They would rent a cottage by the sea or by a lake or something, and we would, and as the two families got bigger, there'd be tents erected at the back for the to make up for the lack of accommodation in a small cottage. But so our children got to know their cousins quite well. Seeing them every 3 years or so. I mean, it was quite a long time apart, but still they kept contact, and with the letters that we had going back and forwards, and then there were tapes, and then there were videos, and then there were this and that. So so yes, we've kept in quite close contact.